the Harvey Gamage, which is a schooner, 131-foot long wooden schooner that's actually in Portland, not very far, maybe a mile from where we're located. The reason that we're all here tonight, we're celebrating the beginning of a project to transport Maine-grown organic food by sail to Boston. So the transport of this 11 tons of cargo, which is all organically grown, many farms are involved. Our cargo partner is called the Crown of Maine Organic Co-op. COMOC is a cooperative that grew out of a family farm in Aroostook County, run by our dear friend Murata and Leah Cook, who are sisters of the Cook family. They started that company to transport food from their farm up in Aroostook down to where the markets are. So again, rural farmers working to build the links, relationships, and transport to make their family farm viable. Many farmers are still exporting commodities on a high volume, low value basis. And that's because of the trade rules that we have. We are really pleased to have in attendance a training by a very high-ranking member of Food and Water Watch.
I'm Sarah Alexander. I'm our Deputy Organizing Director, and I cover our national organizing campaigns. Food and Water Watch is in 16 states throughout the U.S., and we focus on keeping our food and water under public control. And we're working for a fair food system so that small and medium-sized farmers can thrive and our regional food systems can thrive. I'm only going to talk and give about a 10-minute overview of some of the trade agreements and what it means for our food and water. Trade has always existed in our food system. So no matter how far you go back, there's always been something from another location that we couldn't grow or produce ourselves. And no matter how local you get, and I know Vinland's doing some really amazing things here with local food, but there's always a need to share in the resources in a responsible way to have some of those benefits of what another economy can produce. Now, where this gets really out of whack is when scale and corporations are added into the mix, right? So if I want to just trade something with Nisha, I can barter with her and I can figure out, what seeds she's growing that I need. But once I get to the corporate level and I'm Monsanto and I'm trying to figure out how I can force other countries to take the seeds that they won't buy, that creates a whole nother level and layer of problems. And that's what we're dealing with now with the current trade agreements and the free trade agreements that have happened in the past. We asked who's heard of NAFTA, and just raise your hands again so I can get a sense of the crowd. Okay, so everyone, that passed in 1993. Here in the US, we lost 700,000 jobs that were shipped to plants overseas or businesses that went out of business because they could no longer compete. And that creates a race to the bottom, right? So when we equalize trade and say that your standards and our standards, we're gonna push them down to the lowest common denominator, whether it's for labor rights or environmental standards. So in the way that NAFTA works for agriculture, so Severin mentioned a little bit about displacing farmers off the land. Well, it really impacted US farmers and the US agricultural system as well. And there were a set of other supports and mechanisms that supported farmers that had been systematically dismantled since the 1970s up through the mid-90s. And the culmination of NAFTA, as well as the loss of these support and common sense regulations for our farming and food systems, resulted in massive bankruptcy of farms in the 90s. And even though some people will say farm bills have always existed since the 1930s, the modern day farm bill and direct payment support that we talk about for big farmers, subsidies, things for crop growing corn and soy and that sort of stuff, didn't actually really exist in its modern day interpretation until 1996. When so many farmers were going out of business because even though they were planting more and more crops, the price of corn and the price of soy went down and they couldn't make ends meet. It cost more to produce the food than they could sell it for. And so the federal government stepped in and started paying emergency payments. Well, the broken system that created that has never been fixed. And so that we still have that farm policy today around direct payments. And it's not farmers, it's the corporations who benefit. So they can buy the corn and soybeans on the global market for a lower price than it costs to produce the corn and soybeans and other commodity crops. And the government steps in and makes up the difference in payment just so farmers can make ends meet. I mean, farming is a heroic job. Unfortunately, the coming free trade agreements will only make it worse. So we didn't think it could get worse, but there actually is more bottom to race to. And that race to the future bottom looks like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade Investment Agreement. So we just went through a huge fight to stop fast-track authority. And a lot of you nodding your heads, you're probably involved with this. The good news is that the Maine congressional delegation all voted against fast-track authority. They voted down. The New England congressional delegation, for the most part, gets that this is not something that is going to help our local economies. And there are two economies that are especially threatened with these trade agreements. So our fishing economy and our waterfront economy. The Trans-Pacific Partnership would allow South Pacific countries that are part of this trade agreement, who mostly produce cheap farm-raised fish that have lower standards of production, that are produced with many chemicals that aren't allowed here in the US. So allow more of that fish to be imported to compete with the wild-caught fish and the fisheries here in the New England region, that fishermen are getting a fair price for their fish, right? So this is a race to the bottom for our fishing economies and for our local economies. And specifically, Severin asked me to address the Transatlantic Partnership with Europe. So we don't have a lot of tariffs with Europe, right? We don't really think about that being a trade area that we need to expand into. We've had trade with Europe since before the US was a country. But what the transatlantic trade agreements are about are actually our corporations forcing our standards on Europe, which actually have higher standards. So they have labeling for genetically engineered foods. They have bans on growing a lot of genetically engineered foods. They have higher standards around what sorts of chemicals are allowed in the foods. So for example, they have bans on using RBGH, which is an artificial growth hormone used in dairy. They have bans on other things like ractopamine, which is used in pork production, other chemicals like that. And our US agricultural big ag businesses want to be able to force our products on Europe and lower their standards. Now, why would Europe accept this? Well, there's something that Europe wants. And the main thing that Europe wants out of the trade deal is to get rid of localization. So I know there are a lot of amazing programs here in Maine that are looking at local procurement. So how can our schools, our governments, our businesses, how can we use the money that's in the institutions that already exist to support our local food economies? Can we say that we're going to get all of the milk for the school lunch program from dairies in Maine? Well, yeah, right now we can say that, and some schools are saying that. but under the transatlantic trade agreement, that sort of localization around procurement would be illegal. So we say, well, so what? We can just do it anyway, right? We're Maine, we're independent, we just do what we want, we don't care what Europe says. But that's when the investor-state disputes come into play. But what this basically means is that a corporation, which we know are not people, right? But a corporation can actually sue a government and say that your law is a trade barrier and affects my profits, and I'm suing you for the damages of losing that profit. So this seems crazy, right? What kind of system would support this? What politicians would support this? How could this be something that we end up with? But we're seeing this right now. So the US government is about to overturn country of origin labeling. So this, when you go to the store right now, meat, poultry, fruits, and vegetables have to say what country it was produced in. So it'll say product of USA, product of Brazil, product of Mexico, and companies, well, actually Mexico and Canada, but really backed by the big meat companies that don't want these regulations, have brought a suit through the World Trade Organization to say that that is a barrier to trade. And having product of USA makes it seem like product of Canada and product of Mexico is less good. Not that we want to support our local economies, or maybe we're worried about our food miles, or I don't want something coming, halfway around the world. Think of all the transportation that goes into that, and let alone the production standards, right? So many countries have different production standards, but right now, Mexico and Canada are winning this dispute at the World Trade Organization. And even though the dispute isn't over, and what would happen if we lose is that we would have to pay a tariff. So the US does this all the time. We will pay tariff on cotton because we're subsidizing our cotton producers, and so other countries say that's unfair, and so yeah, we'll pay a fine for that because the US government cares about that. But when it comes to country of origin labeling, which is a common sense regulation that passed overwhelmingly like 3 different times in 2002, 2005, 2008, the US Congress, the House of Representatives, just unilaterally got rid of country of origin labeling a few weeks ago, and now the Senate is set to take up the same vote. And because they're doing this before the WTO has even finished the dispute process, this becomes an invitation for future challenges, corporate challenges, right? Because it's like, oh, we just gave in without even getting through the whole process. Now, we're just going to change the law. So that's a current example, but there are lots of future examples. So Maine has a law that would label genetically engineered foods. It will go into effect when other states also pass that law, or it could go into effect when the state decides to pass it as a standalone piece of legislation. But other countries, if these trade agreements pass, could actually sue over that law being a trade to barrier in the same way that country of origin labeling is a trade barrier. Think of all the corporations that are out there. What are their trade barriers? What kinds of common sense protections have we put in place for our people, whether it's wages or work week or paid sick leave or environmental regulations or things that tell us what's in our food? All of those are under threat with these trade agreements that we're looking at now.